Hello, I'm Jonathan Jardina, and I just posting this video blog to just read my blog from September 12th that was posted on my website, oldbluffer.com, and I'll try to put the link in the description if they allow me to, but if not, it's easy to remember. It's just the word oldbluffer, one word, .com, and there's several posts on there, and there'll be more coming up. So the one I'm reading is called "Don't Get Misled" about Milton Friedman, and again, if you want to read it, the the version that you can just copy and paste the word from the text from, there's a text version on my website. But it begins, in the deficit myth by Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie Kelton attacked Milton Friedman. Let me start over, I'm sorry. In the deficit myth, Stephanie Kelton attacked Milton Friedman and the Fed. Her attack on the Fed may end up aging well, but her attack on Friedman is almost certainly flawed. According to her, the Fed aims to keep just the right, unquote, amount of unemployment in the system, much like Friedman prescribed a half-century ago, unquote. The accusation is true enough, but if we know what Friedman wrote, then we can discern that Friedman had an obvious defense. He, quote, aims to allow some unemployment the same way that scientists, quote, aim to allow only 92 elements. Sure, we can have low unemployment regardless of what policymakers do, just like we can have an unemployment, just like we can have an element with an atomic number 118. All Friedman was saying was that the low unemployment won't last if policy is otherwise antithetical to low unemployment. Likewise, an element with an atomic number greater than 92 can exist, but it won't exist for very long at all. Kelton didn't cite any primary sources for Friedman, but it's not difficult for an economist to figure out which article she was referring to. And I put the citation is The Role of Monetary Policy from American Economic Review, March 1968. And I'll post a link to that article there. It's a very famous article. Kelton was not the first economist to interpret Friedman as saying that unemployment can be too low. The concept of a natural rate of unemployment has bothered me ever since I was a sophomore enrolled in principles of macroeconomics. So I want to be sympathetic to folks who are skeptical. A professor of mine used to say that the unemployment rate is 100% if it's you. In other words, if you are someone who is unemployed. If we read Friedman carefully, he is not saying that an economy has to have some unemployment, or at least he's not saying that we have to have the type of unemployment that causes people pain. Friedman instead taught that low unemployment can be as unstable as a transuranium element, which means an element with an atomic number that's higher than 92. Something that has to be concocted in a laboratory and only exists for a split second. That's not in that remark is not in the text of it, but I thought maybe I could. If there's any confusion of what a transuranium element is, then thought that maybe I'd throw that in there. But anyway, Friedman also taught that low unemployment could be sustainable given the right conditions. First, let's focus on Kelton's attack on the Fed. She argued that the Fed, quote, uses unemployed human beings as its primary weapon against inflation, unquote. The Fed has a mandate, stable prices, and according to Kelton, the mandate, quote, framework assumes that the Federal Reserve has the ability to move the economy to its sweet spot where just the quote right number of people are kept on the sidelines wanting to work but trapped in unemployment for the sake of keeping prices in check. That's in her book, The Deficit Myth. She gave readers the impression that the Fed is willing to sacrifice people in order to achieve the objective of stable prices. It sounds so ghoulish. It makes you wonder if there is a, quote, smoking gun, an instance where a Fed official admitted to such an act of human sacrifice. According to Kelton, the Fed, quote, errs on the side of over-tightening, raising the interest rate even when it may be premature or a false alarm, end quote. Fed chairmen and journalists talk often about the natural rate of unemployment. Since journalists can be expected to be relatively unbiased, let's explore what one of them reported first. In early 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that Jerome Powell, quote, recently noted that unemployment had fallen to 3.5% just before the pandemic. This, quote, did not result in unwanted upward pressures on inflation, as might have been expected, unquote, Powell said in the speech. And in quote from the journalist. A Fed president said, quote, we should be less fearful about inflation around the corner and recognize that that fear costs millions of jobs, millions of livelihoods, millions of hopes and dreams. And that's from a Grep IP article entitled Inflation Risk, Little Now, but Some See Danger Ahead, from March 2nd, 2022. Okay, maybe by that time, the Fed was influenced by authors like Kelton, but they hardly seemed like a group who were declaring preemptive war on inflation. Of course, Larry Summers dissented, as usual. Quote, Mr. Summers said, today's economists are too quick to conclude from recent decades that low unemployment is no longer inflationary. He said unemployment hasn't stayed low long enough to prove that, end quote. Summers, however, was an establishment Democrat and not affiliated with the Fed at the time, or now by either. Kelton's analysis was outdated almost immediately after her book was published. As the recent book from a Wall Street Journal reporter documents, in the past, as in before summer 2020, the Fed would raise rates when unemployment fell below its, quote, natural rate, on the theory that such a move would keep inflation from rising. For the 2 years of Powell's chairmanship, until the pandemic hit, unemployment had been below, sometimes significantly, the Fed staff's estimate of its natural rate. But inflation hadn't risen. The new policy formulation would no longer raise interest rates simply because unemployment was low, so long as inflation didn't rise too far above 2% for too long. Ben Bernanke was Fed chairman long before 2020, and although he didn't use the phrase natural rate of unemployment in the following passage, he understood it well. Quote, ultimately, inflation is determined almost entirely by the tightness or ease of monetary policy. So the FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, could target the inflation rate at whatever level we thought made the most sense. The maximum sustainable level of employment, however, is determined by a host of factors ranging from the demographics of the labor force to the mix of worker skills to technical developments, and cannot be arbitrarily set by monetary policy makers. As an additional complication, economists cannot know the maximum sustainable level of unemployment with any certainty, but must estimate it based on historical experience, end quote. And that's from his book, his memoir, The Courage to Act. Bernanke could have been talking about the natural rate of unemployment. Maximum sustainable employment is just the flip side of the natural rate of unemployment. Bernanke, of course, knew Friedman's work. Here's Friedman, quote, to avoid misunderstanding, let me emphasize that by using the term natural rate, unquote, of unemployment, I do not mean to suggest that it is immutable and unchangeable. On the contrary, many of the market characteristics that determine its level are man-made and policy-made, unquote. Almost using the same words as Bernanke, Friedman wrote, the monetary authority, quote, cannot know what the natural rate is. Here, my analogy with the periodic table of elements breaks down. A scientist knows that an element with an atomic number above 100 is not natural, but the Fed doesn't know if a 3% unemployment rate is artificially low. For a while, the estimate of the natural rate was approximately 4%. As inflation eroded the real value of the federal minimum wage, the estimates of the natural rate of unemployment fell. Alan Greenspan wrote about the natural rate of unemployment, but he did not associate it with Friedman. He and Kelton seem to be talking about the same natural rate. Ironically, Greenspan, the Republican, dismissed it, while Larry Summers, the Democrat, was worried about a tight labor market. Quote, experts in the mid-90s spent endless hours debating the so-called natural level of unemployment. This is a neo-Keynesian concept that was used in the early 1990s to argue that if unemployment fell below 6.5%, then workers' wage demands would accelerate, causing inflation to heat up. That's Alan Greenspan, who is supposed to be this conservative, hard money guy, or was considered that. Evidently, Friedman also rejected the neo-Keynesian notion. In a question and answer session, a man told Friedman, you say that full employment can lead to inflation, unquote. Friedman disagreed strongly. He replied, quote, I did not say that full employment led to inflation. I said that a full employment policy led to inflation. That is quite a different thing. A full employment policy is likely to mean that you do not have full employment, because a full employment policy tends to be an open invitation to everybody, to try to push up wage rates here, there, and elsewhere. The rise in wage rates can the rise in wage rates lead to unemployment. In trying to counter the unemployment, the government is likely to increase the money supply, and this tends to produce inflation. End quote. That's Milton Friedman from a discussion in the 1960s. Even if Friedman didn't believe that we could attain full employment, he certainly didn't recommend an unemployment target. As he said so eloquently, quote, the monetary authority should guide itself by magnitudes that it can control, not by ones that it cannot control. If, as the authority has often done, it takes interest rates or the current unemployment percentage as the immediate criterion of policy, it will be like a space vehicle that has taken a fix on the wrong star. No matter how sensitive and sophisticated its guiding apparatus, the space vehicle will go astray, unquote. Kelton's criticism of Friedman was implicit, but it was scathing. If you believe her, then you think that Friedman promoted a quote, doctrine that relies on human suffering to fight inflation, unquote. The Friedman who wanted to use human beings as pawns in some inflation fighting game is a myth. The real Friedman was against too much unemployment. It's true that he said, quote, governments have produced high inflation as a deliberate, uh, no, I'm sorry. Quote, governments have not produced high inflation as a deliberate announced policy, but as a consequence of other policies, in particular policies of full employment. He was, however, not against full employment. What he meant to say was, quote, full employment policy is a modern invention for producing inflation. More recently, George Selgin has reaffirmed Friedman's observation. Today, as a result of the inflation of the 1970s, the Fed is obligated to focus on price stability. Prior to the 1970s, only the Employment Act of 1946 was on the books, and it made the government responsible for full employment. Just imagine if the government still only focused on, quote, maximum employment. So now that's a Selgin, quote, a simple maximum employment mandate might be understood as calling on the Fed to create liquidity to boost employment, even when doing so would aggravate the boom-bust cycle or generate undesirable inflation, unquote. Although we all want to be able to find jobs, the above reasons inspired me to write elsewhere that, quote, an emphasis on, quote, full employment should actually fill us with a sense of foreboding. And but so the blog post is more of a defense of Friedman. The Kelton book is describing. Now this isn't in the blog itself, but I think the Kelton book is maybe describing a conservative economist, or maybe a neo-Keynesian from the 1990s. But it's not describing Milton Friedman. This is not. I mean, with all due respect, this is not accurate at all. Like, this characterization in the book is not. It's just not accurate. But if you disagree, maybe you could comment in the comment section, or maybe skim through the blog and see if it's easier to comprehend than just me trying to read it for you. And enough on that. I guess I didn't prepare a new blog yet, but I think because there's a lot of chatter on Twitter about how, oh, you know, the Fed is going to cause a recession, or, you know, I guess in the news media, the more impartial news media might say that you know, Powell can't have his, quote, soft landing that you may have heard about if you're following the financial press, and there's going to be a recession, and it's going to be his fault. I may have to comment on that. An article that I quote from a lot is about the bond market, and this is relevant to Kelton's book, because Kelton talks about how, you know, they're you know, I'm maybe not totally right about this, because I'm going off the memory of the book, but I think she's saying that there won't be a bond buyer strike, or at least she didn't think there would be a bond buyer strike. And the bond buyer strike is basically, you know, something that used to happen, I guess, in the past. But the term bond vigilantes was used for these type of deals, type of situations. I mean, when the bond buyers didn't want to buy treasury debt, or debt instruments, notes, treasury bonds, and so lo and behold, um, after Kelton's book was published in 2021, you had the bond market really didn't want to buy long-term bonds. Yeah, the 10-year bonds, they didn't want to buy long-term bonds because they were assuming that there was going to be inflation, now we see that there was inflation. They were correct about that, and but anyway, that I bring this up because Kelton in a book, which I don't have anymore. I brought it back to the library the other day. But Kelton does talk about how these auctions, and people should be happy to buy bonds, treasury bonds, but they weren't too crazy about buying the treasury bonds in March 2021 because they thought there was going to be inflation, and they were right. So something needs to be said about that, because if the bond market stops buying the treasury bond, Powell doesn't have. I mean, there's no good outcome, So I mean, I'm just speculating, but that the options may be, recession now, pain now, or try to put it off, or do what the people on Twitter want, and not have a recession now. But but if the bond buyers go on strike, there's going to be more inflation, because the Fed will have to monetize the debt to keep the shorter term interest rates down for a little longer. But there may be a divergence between the short term interest rates and the longer term interest rates. And again, I'm speculating, but if that happens, then you can't postpone the pain then indefinitely. The pain's going to come. It may be that their options are, pain now. Unfortunately, some pain now for the people, and it's not. I feel bad for the people that's going to suffer in the recession. But it's either a recession now, or maybe no recession now, but instead have a really, really nasty depression later on, when the people, when the bond market revolts. And but again, I'm speculating, but it's something that needs to be looked at, and maybe my next blog, when it comes out, it'll be about that. But I digress. I'll try to post a link to the Kelton book, the Kelton book maybe, and the Kelton in my blog about Kelton. Stephanie Kelton, the author of the Deficit Myth, and her caricature of Milton Friedman. So thank you for listening, and like I said, there's more on oldbluffer.com. So, but that's all for now. Until next time, see ya.